She gave her the last handful of dried venison. She wrapped her in her only warm blanket when the frost came. She called her Snowdrop, thinking she was just a starving white pup that no one else wanted, just like her. Pamela didn't know that the tiny creature curled up by her dying fire wasn't a stray at all. She was the lost princess of the most powerful werewolf kingdom in the realm. And when 4 massive black wolves emerged from the fog surrounding her crumbling cabin one Tuesday morning, Pamela Warren thought she was going to die. She didn't realize that the crowned warrior stepping through the mist wasn't there to execute her. He was there to kneel before the white pup sleeping in her arms. Before we get into the story, take a second to subscribe, like, and comment where you're watching from. I'd love to know if this story reaches Canada, the United States, Australia, Africa, or the United Kingdom. Let me know where you're listening from. Now, let's begin. The fog in the gray zone didn't just obscure. It swallowed you whole. Pamela Warren knew that feeling well. It was the same way she felt 5 years ago when Alpha Marcus of the Silver Pine Pack had thrown her belongings into the mud outside the pack house. You're barren, Pamela. A defective Omega. I need a mate who can strengthen my bloodline, not some broken charity case. The words still echoed in the silence of her cabin. It was a collapsing structure with a caved-in roof, located in the gray zone, the fog-shrouded, lawless strip of territory between the civilized werewolf kingdoms and the wild forests where rogues and outcasts hid. No one lived here unless they had nowhere else to go. Pamela pulled her threadbare brown hood tighter around her face and pushed open the warped wooden door. The morning mist curled around her ankles, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant pine. "Snowdrop," she called out softly. "You out there, little one?" A rustle from beneath the sagging porch. A pair of unusual eyes, one pale blue, one silver, peered out from the shadows. The pup crawled forward slowly. She was a mess of matted white fur, so thin her ribs showed through her coat, but her eyes held a strange, unsettling intelligence. She wasn't a normal wolf cub. She was too small for a timber wolf, too delicate for a coyote. She looked like something precious that someone had tried very hard to destroy. "Hey, beautiful girl," Pamela whispered, crouching down. The cold seeped through her worn boots, but she ignored it. She reached into the pocket of her patched jacket and pulled out a small cloth bundle. Inside was a strip of dried venison, the last of her meat ration. She hadn't eaten protein in 4 days. She survived on foraged roots and melted snow so she could save the good food for Snowdrop. "Got something special today," she murmured, tearing off a piece. The pup didn't lunge for it. She never did. She looked at the meat, then up at Pamela's gaunt, pale face. She whined low in her throat, pushing the food back toward Pamela with her nose, as if begging her to eat it instead. "Stop that," Pamela scolded gently, scratching behind the pup's soft ears. "I had a big breakfast. I promise. You need your strength more than I do." It was a lie. She'd had nothing but weak tea made from pine needles. But looking at this creature, abandoned, starving, alone, she felt a connection that went deeper than hunger. Snowdrop was a reject, just like her. They were both discarded things that the world had decided weren't worth keeping. For the last 8 months, this had been her ritual. Wake before dawn, work odd jobs in the border town for scraps of pay, come home, feed Snowdrop, and sleep on the floor because she'd given her only blanket to the pup. It was a pathetic existence for a 28-year-old woman who had once dreamed of being a pack healer. But it was safe. Or so she thought. As the pup finished the venison, her ears suddenly swiveled forward. The fur along her spine stood up in a stiff ridge. She let out a growl that didn't sound like a puppy at all. It sounded like a warning horn echoing across a battlefield. "What is it?" Pamela asked, her heart lurching. She felt it before she heard it. A vibration in the ground. The heavy, rhythmic thud of massive paws moving in formation. Not the shuffling of local deer or the scurrying of rabbits. These were deliberate, powerful, predatory. Pamela stood slowly, dread tightening her chest like iron bands. The gray zone was dangerous, full of rogues, mercenaries, and worse. But nothing came this deep into the fog. Nothing hunted here. Through the mist, 4 shapes materialized. Wolves. But not like any wolves Pamela had ever seen. They were enormous, each one the size of a warhorse, with fur as black as midnight and eyes that glowed amber in the fog. They moved with perfect military precision, spreading out to surround the cabin from all sides. Snowdrop, run. Pamela hissed, trying to shove the pup toward the tree-line. Go. Hide in the woods. But the pup didn't run. She sat down on her haunches, her posture shifting from frightened stray to something else entirely. Something regal. She looked at the approaching wolves not with fear, but with expectation. The 4 black wolves stopped in a perfect semicircle around the cabin. The silence that followed was heavier than the fog itself. Then, through the mist, another figure appeared. A man. No, not a man. A king. He was massive, easily towering over 7 feet, wearing dark armor etched with ancient runes. A crown of black iron and wolf bone sat upon his head, and a fur-lined cloak draped from his broad shoulders. His face was all sharp angles and hard edges, a warrior's face, scarred and unforgiving. His eyes were molten gold, fierce and burning with barely restrained power. Pamela backed up until her spine hit the rotting wood of her cabin wall. Her Omega instincts, dormant for years, suddenly screamed in terror. Alpha. Warrior. King. Killer. But it wasn't just his size or his crown. It was his scent. Even from 30 yards away, the wind carried the smell of blood, steel, and ancient power, the scent of someone who had built a throne on the bones of his enemies. Stay back, Pamela yelled, her voice shaking. She grabbed a broken fence post from the ground. It was a laughable weapon against one of those wolves, let alone their crowned master. The man stopped at the edge of her property. He looked at the makeshift weapon, then at Pamela with an expression that held no warmth. No mercy. We are not here for you, Omega, the king rumbled. His voice was deep, like distant thunder rolling across mountains. Pamela's heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought they might crack. Then leave. You're trespassing. The king ignored her completely. His golden eyes shifted past her trembling form, locking onto the small white pup sitting calmly on the porch. And then, impossibly, the crowned king dropped to one knee. Pamela blinked in shock. The 4 massive black wolves behind him also lowered themselves, pressing their enormous bodies to the ground and exposing their throats in a gesture of absolute submission. Not to her. To Snowdrop. Princess Isla, the king said, his voice trembling with barely controlled emotion. We have secured the perimeter. Your guards have arrived. You are safe now. Pamela looked down at the white pup, at Snowdrop, in complete disbelief. The pup stood slowly. She shook out her matted fur, and suddenly the air around her shimmered like heat rising from summer stones. Bones cracked and reformed. Fur receded into pale skin. White light flared. In seconds, the pup was gone. Standing in her place was a tiny child, no more than 4 years old. She was naked and shivering in the cold morning air, with silver blonde hair falling in tangled waves around her face, and those same mismatched eyes, one blue, one silver. She looked fragile, breakable, like a princess from a forgotten fairy tale. She turned and looked up at Pamela with those impossibly old eyes. Pammy, the child whispered in a small, trembling voice. Don't be scared. They came for me. Pamela dropped the fence post. It clattered onto the ground with a hollow thud. The child, the princess, ran to Pamela and wrapped her thin arms around her waist, burying her face in Pamela's threadbare jacket. I was lost, Isla whispered, her voice muffled. The bad people hurt me. They put magic on me so I couldn't change back. I was so hungry, Pammy. But you found me. You saved me. Pamela stood frozen, her mind struggling to process what was happening. This wasn't a stray pup. This was a royal child, kidnapped, cursed, trapped in wolf form. and she had been feeding her table scraps. "Step away from the princess." The voice came from directly in front of her now, and it carried so much raw power that the cabin windows rattled in their broken frames. The crowned king had risen and was now walking up the porch steps. Each footfall made the rotting wood groan. He moved like a storm-given form, beautiful, terrifying, unstoppable. His golden eyes locked onto Pamela's hands, which were instinctively resting on the child's shoulders. "I said," the king growled, his canines lengthening as his wolf surfaced, "step away from my daughter. If you touch her again, I will tear your throat out before you can scream." Pamela wanted to obey. Every instinct in her Omega wolf was screaming at her to submit, to bare her neck, to drop to the ground before this apex predator. But the tiny child clinging to her waist was shivering violently, her bare skin prickling with goosebumps in the morning frost. "She's freezing," Pamela heard herself say, her voice steadier than she felt. The protective instinct overrode the terror. She didn't step away. Instead, she pulled off her own threadbare jacket and wrapped it around the child's naked shoulders. King Alaric Blackthorn stopped halfway up the porch stairs. He stared at the jacket, patched, stained, worn to threads, now covering his daughter. Then his burning gold eyes lifted to meet Pamela's defiant blue ones. He looked genuinely confused that she wasn't currently groveling in the dirt. "Daddy, stop," Isla said, her voice small but firm. She pressed herself harder against Pamela's legs. "Pammy's not one of the bad ones. She saved me." The king's expression didn't soften, but the murderous intent in his eyes dialed down from immediate execution to severe suspicion. He climbed the final steps, the wood groaning under his weight like it might collapse at any moment. He reached down and carefully lifted Isla into his arms, holding her against his armored chest as though she were made of spun glass. "I have you," he whispered into her tangled hair, his voice cracking for just a fraction of a second. "I have you now, little star." He looked over Isla's head at one of the massive black wolves. The creature shifted instantly, bones snapping and reforming, until a tall man with dark skin and silver-streaked hair stood in its place. He wore the same runic armor as the king. "Commander Thorn," Alaric said, his voice returning to that hard, commanding tone. "Get the princess to the warm carriage. Alert the royal physician. I want her examined immediately." The commander moved with precision, taking Isla gently from the king's arms. "Wait," Isla cried, reaching back toward Pamela. "Pammy has to come too. She fed me every day. She gave me her blanket. She's my friend." "We will handle her, Isla," Alaric said dismissively, not looking at Pamela. "You need warmth and healing." As soon as Isla was carried through the fog toward a massive black carriage Pamela hadn't even noticed before, the atmosphere on the porch shifted. The king turned back to face her, and the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. He towered over her, blocking out what little light filtered through the fog. He smelled like smoke and steel and something darker, old magic, ancient power, violence barely leashed. "Who are you?" he demanded. "Pamela. Pamela Warren." "Warren." The king's eyes narrowed. "Silverpine Pack?" "Formerly," Pamela whispered, her throat tight. "I was cast out." "A rogue," he sneered, and the word dripped with contempt. "Living in a shack in the lawless zone. And I'm supposed to believe you just happened to find the missing heir to the Wolf Kingdom, a child who has been hunted by every mercenary and dark mage in the realm for 8 months. He stepped closer, backing her against the cabin wall. His face was inches from hers now, and she could see the faint scars crossing his jaw, the silver threads in his dark beard, the absolute lack of mercy in those gold eyes. "How much did they pay you to hide her here?" "Nobody paid me anything," Pamela cried, tears stinging her eyes. "I found her half dead, eating out of my trash pile. I thought she was a sick dog. I shared my food with her. I gave her the only blanket I owned." Alaric grabbed her chin, forcing her to look at him. His hand was burning hot against her cold skin. "You're lying. You smell like fear. You smell like poverty." His eyes scanned the cabin through the broken window, the collapsed roof, the empty cupboards, the single dying fire. He saw her boots, wrapped in cloth strips because the soles had worn through. He saw the nail marks on the doorframe where she'd tried to reinforce it against winter winds. His grip on her chin tightened, then released abruptly. "I gave her everything I had," Pamela said, her voice breaking. "If I'd kidnapped a princess, don't you think I'd be living better than this?" The king stared at her for a long moment. She could feel him using his alpha senses, searching for deception. He found none. She watched something shift in his expression, not softness, but calculation. "Commander Thorne," he barked without turning around. The silver-haired man reappeared instantly. "Your Majesty? Burn this structure to the ground." "No," Pamela screamed. "It's all I have." "Not anymore," Alaric said coldly. He grabbed her arm, his grip iron but not painful. "You're coming with us." "Am I under arrest?" Pamela struggled, but it was like fighting a mountain. "You are a material witness in the kidnapping of my daughter," he said as he dragged her down the steps toward the waiting carriages. "And Isla has clearly formed an attachment to you. If I leave you here, you'll be dead by nightfall. The ones who took her will return to eliminate loose ends." He stopped at the open door of an obsidian-black carriage with silver wolves carved into its sides. He looked down at her with those unreadable golden eyes. "And I don't like owing debts, Miss Warren. You kept my daughter alive. For that, you've earned protection." His voice dropped to a dangerous rumble. "But if I discover you're lying, if you had any part in her abduction, I will execute you myself." He pushed her into the carriage where Isla sat wrapped in furs, reaching for her with desperate hands. As Pamela collapsed onto the velvet seat, she looked back through the window. Commander Thorne threw a torch onto her porch. The cabin, her home for 5 years, went up in flames, consumed by fire and fog. The carriage lurched forward, pulled by horses she couldn't see, heading toward the mountains where Shadow Peak Castle waited like a crown of black stone against the sky. Pamela held Isla's small, warm hand and realized 2 things. First, she was no longer a forgotten exile. Second, she had just entered the den of the most dangerous predator in the realm, and she had absolutely no idea if she was a guest, a witness, or already condemned to die. The journey to Shadow Peak Castle took 3 hours through mountain passes that seemed carved by giants. The road wasn't really a road at all. It was a ribbon of smooth black stone that wound through ancient pines, guarded by watchtowers and patrolled by wolves that melted in and out of the fog like ghosts. Pamela sat in the corner of the carriage, trying to make herself small while Isla slept with her head in Pamela's lap, one small hand gripping the hem of her worn shirt so tightly her knuckles were white. King Alaric sat across from them, working on a leather-bound ledger. He hadn't spoken a single word since they'd left the burning cabin. The scratch of his pen was the only sound besides the rhythmic clatter of hooves on stone. He didn't look like a father who'd just recovered his lost child. He looked like a general planning a war. The carriage finally slowed as they approached massive iron gates worked with silver wolves and crescent moons. Beyond them rose Shadow Peak itself, a fortress of black stone and dark glass built into the side of a mountain cliff. It was beautiful in a brutal way, all sharp towers and narrow windows, designed to withstand siege and storm. Just like its king. "We're here," Alaric said, closing the ledger with a snap that made Pamela flinch. The doors opened to chaos. Staff in dark uniforms swarmed the carriage, guards with swords, servants with blankets, and a team of physicians carrying a medical bag and a stretcher. The head physician, an older woman with steel-gray hair, reached into the carriage for Isla. "No!" Isla woke screaming, scrambling backward into Pamela's arms. "Don't touch me. Pammy, don't let them take me." The physician froze, her hands suspended in midair. "Your Highness, we need to examine you. You've been missing for..." "Get away." Isla's eyes flashed silver, her wolf surfacing in pure panic. Her small fingers dug into Pamela's arms hard enough to draw blood. Alaric stepped out of the carriage, his jaw tight with frustration. Isla, let the physicians help you. You're malnourished. You could have infections, broken bones. I want Pammy. The child's voice cracked with desperation. The king sighed, a sound of profound exhaustion that seemed to age him 10 years. He looked at Pamela with something close to resentment. Go with her. Stay out of the physician's way. If you interfere with her treatment, Commander Thorne will remove you. Understood. Pamela nodded quickly, scrambling out of the carriage with Isla still clinging to her like a barnacle. She felt the eyes of every servant, every guard, every courtier on her, judging her threadbare clothes that smelled of smoke and poverty, judging her tangled brown hair and the dirt under her fingernails. She was a stain on their pristine marble floors, a weed in their manicured garden. She held Isla's hand as they rushed through corridors of polished black stone and silver sconces, up winding stairs, through doors carved with wolves and ancient runes, until they reached a medical wing that smelled of herbs and antiseptic. The physicians worked quickly, blood draws, examinations, warm broth fed carefully through a silver spoon. Isla tolerated it all only because Pamela sat beside her, holding her other hand, whispering reassurances. 3 hours later, Pamela found herself standing alone in an antechamber larger than her entire cabin had been. Isla was finally sleeping in a bed with sheets that probably cost more than Pamela would earn in a year, her silver blonde hair spread across silk pillows, her breathing deep and even. The door opened and King Alaric walked in. He'd removed his armor and crown, wearing instead a simple black shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle and covered in silvery battle scars. He carried a small iron-bound chest. The physician says she's stable, he said, setting the chest on a table between them. Malnourished, dehydrated, suffering from magical exhaustion from being forced to hold her shift for so long. But she'll recover. Because of you. He opened the chest. Inside were gold coins, hundreds of them, glinting in the candlelight, and official-looking documents with royal seals. 5,000 gold crowns, Alaric stated flatly. Enough to buy a house in any city in the realm. New identity papers. A letter of safe conduct signed by me personally. No one will touch you. You can start over. Live well. This is the transaction. You saved my daughter. I pay the debt. You leave. Pamela stared at the gold. It was more money than she'd seen in her entire life. She could eat real food. She could have heat and safety and a future. She could stop surviving and start living. Her hand trembled as she reached for the documents. Then she looked through the open door at Isla, small and fragile in that massive bed, already starting to whimper in her sleep. Pamela picked up the papers and the letter of safe conduct. She tore them in half, then in quarters. She let the pieces flutter to the marble floor like snow. She needs me, Pamela said quietly, meeting the king's shocked golden eyes. I'm not leaving her. She is a child, Alaric said through clenched teeth. She's traumatized. She'll forget you in a week. She woke up screaming for me 5 times while they were examining her, Pamela said, finding strength she didn't know she had. She doesn't trust you yet. But she trusts me. Something cracked in Alaric's hand, not the chest, but the edge of the table where his fingers had been gripping. Wood splintered under the pressure. Do not, he growled, alpha power rolling off him in waves that made Pamela's Omega Wolf whine in submission, presume to tell me what my own daughter needs. Then ask her, Pamela shot back, fear eclipsed momentarily by anger. Ask her who she wants when she wakes up screaming from nightmares about the people who hurt her. I was there. I held her through the winter storms. I picked thorns from her paws. You can't just buy me off like some hired servant and expect her to be fine. The silence stretched between them like a blade. Alaric stared at the torn papers on the floor. No one had said no to the Wolf King in a decade. No one had refused his gold. No one had defied him and lived. He looked at her with a new expression. Not respect, not yet, but something like dangerous curiosity. You're a fool, he said softly. You think staying here is a reward. This castle is a target. My enemies are still out there. If you stay, you enter the line of fire. I survived 5 years in the gray zone, Pamela said. I know how to survive. Alaric studied her for a long moment. Then something shifted in his expression, a decision made. Fine. You want a position? You have one. You are Isla's royal guardian. You will stay in the West Wing. You will be available to her at all hours. And if I discover you're working for the ones who took her, if this is some elaborate scheme, I will kill you myself. Understood, Pamela whispered. He turned to leave, his boots echoing on the marble. At the door, he paused without looking back. And Miss Warren? Get proper clothes. You smell like wet dog and desperation. It's offensive. The door closed with a heavy thud. Pamela waited until his footsteps faded, then sank to her knees on the expensive floor. She was shaking. She had justified the Wolf King to his face. She was alive. But in a castle full of enemies who saw her as an intruder, how long could that possibly last? 2 weeks passed in a blur of routine and careful navigation. Pamela's days began before dawn in the servants' wing, where she'd been given a small but comfortable room, stone walls, a real bed, a fireplace that actually worked. She would wake to find breakfast already waiting outside her door. Warm bread, cheese, fruit she'd only dreamed of in the gray zone. She ate half and saved the rest, old survival instincts dying hard. Then she would go to Isla. The princess's chambers were in the royal wing, a suite of rooms decorated in silver and white with windows overlooking the mountain valley. Isla would be awake already, sitting in the window seat, waiting. The child was recovering physically, color returning to her cheeks, the hollows under her eyes fading, but the nightmares remained. She refused to sleep unless Pamela was there, sitting in the chair beside her bed, humming old songs from the gray zone. They spent mornings in the library, where Pamela read stories about brave wolves and kind maidens. Afternoons in the gardens, where Isla would shift into her wolf form and chase butterflies while Pamela kept watch. The child was learning to trust her wolf again, slowly, carefully. King Alaric tried. Pamela had to give him credit for that. He would appear in the evenings with expensive toys, wooden horses, silk dolls, music boxes that played haunting melodies. But Isla would just stare at him with those mismatched eyes and hide behind Pamela's skirts. The king's frustration was palpable, a storm barely contained. He would leave the gifts on the table and exit without a word, his jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists. Pamela caught him watching her sometimes from the doorways, his golden eyes burning with something she couldn't quite name. Jealousy, resentment, confusion that this nobody from nowhere had somehow become the center of his daughter's world. It was on the morning of the 3rd week that she met Lady Morgana. Pamela was walking Isla through the portrait gallery when a woman appeared at the far end of the hall. She was breathtaking, tall and willowy, with raven-black hair cascading down her back in perfect waves, wearing a gown of deep emerald silk that probably cost more than Pamela's entire village. Her features were sharp and elegant, like something carved from ice. Well, the woman said, her voice smooth as poisoned honey. So this is the famous savior. Isla's hand tightened in Pamela's grip. I'm Lady Morgana Blackthorn, the woman continued, gliding closer. The king's sister. I've been away on diplomatic matters, but I simply had to return when I heard the news. Her dark eyes traveled over Pamela's simple gray dress, the finest thing she owned, but still clearly servant's clothing. A gray zone reject caring for our princess. How progressive. Isla trusts her, Pamela said quietly, lifting her chin. Of course she does. Trauma creates such strange attachments. Morgana knelt gracefully, reaching toward Isla with jeweled fingers. Hello, darling niece. Do you remember your Aunt Morgana? Isla pressed herself against Pamela's leg and said nothing. Morgana's smile didn't waver, but something cold flashed in her eyes. She straightened, smoothing her skirts. Well, children need time. Though I do wonder, Miss Warren, how long my brother intends to let this arrangement continue. Surely once Isla is properly healed, she'll need a real governess. Someone educated. Someone of appropriate birth. The king made his decision, Pamela said, hating how her voice shook slightly. Did he? Morgana tilted her head. Or did a frightened child make it for him? She smiled, showing perfect white teeth. Enjoy your time here, Miss Warren. I'm sure it will be educational. She swept past them in a rustle of silk and expensive perfume, leaving Pamela feeling somehow smaller, dirtier, more out of place than ever. That evening, Commander Thorne delivered the announcement. The Blood Moon Ball would be held in 3 days. It was the first major court gathering since Isla's return, and her presence was required. A show of strength. A message to the realm that the princess was safe and the royal line secure. Isla's response was immediate and absolute. I'm not going without Pammy. Alaric stood in the doorway of her chambers, still in his training clothes, sweat dampening his dark hair. Isla, this is a formal state function. Miss Warren is your guardian, not a courtier. Then I'm not going. The child crossed her small arms stubbornly. The muscle in Alaric's jaw twitched. He looked at Pamela with barely concealed frustration. Can you talk sense into her? She's 4 years old and still recovering from 8 months of captivity, Pamela said carefully. Maybe forcing her into a crowded ballroom isn't. This isn't a request. The kingdom needs to see her. He turned back to Isla, his voice softening slightly. Please, little star. Just for one evening. Only if Pammy comes. Alaric closed his eyes and exhaled slowly through his nose. When he opened them again, he looked at Pamela with resignation. Fine. Commander Thorne will arrange appropriate attire. 3 hours later, Pamela stood in her chambers surrounded by 3 royal dressmakers who circled her like sharks, taking measurements and making disapproving sounds. The hair will need significant work, one muttered. The skin is sun-damaged, another noted. Well, the head dressmaker said briskly, we've worked miracles before. They scrubbed her in a copper tub until her skin turned pink. They tamed her brown hair with oils and heated irons, transforming the wild waves into an elegant cascade down her back. They painted her face with subtle colors that highlighted her eyes and hid the lingering gauntness in her cheeks. Then came the dress. It was midnight blue velvet, long-sleeved and high-necked, modest yet undeniably beautiful. It hugged her thin frame and made her pale skin look like porcelain. Silver embroidery traced wolf patterns along the hem and cuffs, subtle, but unmistakably royal. When Pamela looked in the mirror, she didn't recognize herself. The rejected Omega from the gray zone was gone. Staring back was a woman who looked like she might actually belong in a castle. Well, the head dressmaker said with grudging approval. You'll do. Pamela touched the soft velvet, her hands trembling slightly. Tomorrow she would walk into a ballroom full of nobles and warriors and predators. She would be judged, analyzed, torn apart by whispers and stares. She thought of Morgana's cold smile, of the way the servants still avoided her eyes, of the castle full of wolves who saw her as an intruder. But Isla needed her. So she would go. And she would survive it, just like she'd survived everything else. The grand ballroom of Shadow Peak Castle blazed with 1,000 candles. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, casting fractured light across marble floors polished to a mirror shine. The air was thick with the scent of pine, musk, and expensive wine. Wolves in formal attire filled the space, alphas in tailored suits, their mates in gowns that cost more than small villages, all of them powerful, dangerous, watching. When the herald's voice rang out, Her Royal Highness, Princess Isla Blackthorne, and her royal guardian, Miss Pamela Warren, the room fell silent. Pamela walked down the grand staircase with Isla's small hand clasped tightly in hers. The princess wore white silk and silver ribbons, looking like a tiny moon goddess. But every eye in that ballroom slid past the child to fix on the unknown woman beside her. Pamela kept her chin up, her spine straight, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. The midnight blue velvet whispered against the stairs. Her brown hair, elegantly styled, caught the candlelight. She looked like someone who might belong here, even if she felt like an imposter. King Alaric waited at the bottom of the stairs. He wore black formal attire that fit him like armor, a silver wolf's head pinned at his collar, his iron crown catching the light. When he turned to greet his daughter, his golden eyes landed on Pamela. He froze mid-step. His gaze traveled slowly from her styled hair to the velvet gown to the silver-embroidered hem. He stopped breathing for a heartbeat. Something shifted in his expression, surprise, then something deeper, more primal. His wolf stirred behind those golden eyes with an appreciative rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floor. He'd expected her to clean up presentably. He hadn't expected this. "Daddy." Isla released Pamela's hand and ran to him. He caught her automatically, lifting her up, but his eyes never left Pamela's face. "You look," he started, his voice rougher than usual. He cleared his throat. "Acceptable." Pamela felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Thank you, Your Majesty." "Stay close," he commanded, moving to stand beside her. His hand settled on the small of her back, burning through the velvet like a brand. "The court wolves will circle. Smile. Say nothing they can use against you." He was right. As they moved through the crowd, alphas approached with false smiles and calculating eyes, offering congratulations on Isla's return while studying Pamela like a puzzle to be solved. "And who is this lovely creature, Your Majesty?" asked Alpha Theron of the Coastal Pack, his gaze lingering too long on Pamela's neckline. "The princess's royal guardian," Alaric said sharply, his grip on her back tightening possessively. "Look elsewhere, Theron." The questions kept coming. Where was she from? What pack? What bloodline? Pamela deflected as best she could, but she felt the judgment in every stare. The servants recognized servants' hands no matter how fine the gloves. The highborn smelled poverty beneath expensive perfume. Then the crowd parted and Pamela's blood turned to ice. Standing near the wine table, holding a crystal goblet and swaying slightly, was a man with sandy blonde hair and a cruel, handsome face gone red with drink. Alpha Marcus of the Silver Pine Pack. The man who had destroyed her life. Their eyes met across the ballroom. Recognition flashed in his face, followed by vicious delight. Well, Marcus said loudly, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room. He pushed through the crowd, wine sloshing over his hand. "I thought I smelled something familiar." "Something rejected." Pamela instinctively stepped behind Alaric. The king's entire body went rigid. Marcus laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Your Majesty, do you know what you've brought into your castle?" He pointed at Pamela with his wine glass. "That's Pamela Warren, the Baron Omega. I threw her out 5 years ago because she couldn't produce a single pup. She's a genetic dead end. A failure." The whispers started immediately. "Baron. Defective. Reject. What's she doing here?" Marcus continued, emboldened by drink and cruelty. "Wearing velvet like she's somebody? Playing guardian to the princess." He sneered. "She can't even keep a goldfish alive, let alone a royal child." Tears burned behind Pamela's eyes. The old shame crashed over her like a wave, drowning her. Every head in the ballroom had turned. Every wolf was watching her humiliation. "Is this true?" someone whispered nearby. "A Baron Omega in the royal household? Scandalous." Alaric handed Isla to Commander Thorne without a word. The commander whisked the child away instantly, understanding without being told. The king turned fully toward Marcus, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. He didn't look angry. He looked calm, which was infinitely more terrifying. "Watch your tone, Marcus," Alaric said softly, each word precise and sharp as a blade. "You're a guest in my house. I'm doing you a favor, King." Marcus staggered closer, wine-drunk and stupid. He looked at Pamela with disgust. "She's broken." Can't breed, can't shift properly, can't do anything except leech off better wolves. I'm just warning you before she. He reached out to grab Pamela's arm. The crack of breaking bone echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot. Marcus screamed, dropping to his knees. Alaric had moved faster than the eye could follow, catching the alpha's wrist and twisting it at an unnatural angle. The wine glass shattered on the marble floor, red liquid spreading like blood. Touch her again, Alaric whispered, his voice amplified by the absolute silence in the room, and I will tear your arm off and beat you to death with it. He shoved Marcus backward. The silver pine alpha crashed into a serving table, sending silver platters clattering across the floor. Alaric turned to face the entire assembly, his golden eyes blazing with power that made every wolf in the room lower their gaze instinctively. Pamela Warren is under the protection of the Onyx Crown, he announced, his voice booming like thunder. She saved my daughter's life. She kept the heir to this kingdom alive through 8 months of winter when trained warriors and hired mercenaries failed. Anyone who disrespects her disrespects my daughter. He paused, letting the words sink in. Then his voice dropped to a deadly growl. And anyone who disrespects my daughter declares war on me. He turned back to Pamela. She was trembling, tears streaming silently down her carefully painted face. Alaric did something then that shocked every noble in the Western Kingdoms. He removed his formal jacket and draped it over her shoulders. The gesture was unmistakable, a claiming move, a primal signal of protection and possession. Are you all right? He asked quietly, his voice suddenly intimate, as if they were alone. Yes, Pamela breathed. Good. He turned to his guards. Escort Alpha Marcus from my castle. Revoke his trade agreements. He is no longer welcome at Shadow Peak. As the guards dragged the cursing, whimpering Marcus away, Alaric offered Pamela his arm. She took it with shaking fingers, feeling the solid strength beneath the fine fabric. The crowd parted before them like water. Touch her again, Alaric said conversationally as they walked past the shocked nobles, and I'll mount your head on the castle walls. And Pamela realized, for the first time in 5 years, what it felt like to be protected, to be valued, to be safe. The music had started again, trying to cover the violence with string quartets and false gaiety. Nobles returned to their conversations in hushed tones, still throwing furtive glances at Pamela and the king. Alaric kept her close, his hand a constant presence at her back, a silent warning to anyone considering Marcus's fate. A servant appeared beside them carrying a silver tray with fresh drinks. He bowed low, his movements practiced and smooth. Compliments of the house, your majesty, the servant said, offering a crystal glass filled with amber liquid. Your preferred scotch. Alaric reached for the glass absently, still scanning the crowd with sharp eyes, looking for other threats. His fingers had just closed around the stem when Pamela's nose twitched. Beneath the rich scent of aged alcohol and oak, there was something else. Something bitter and wrong, like crushed almonds mixed with metal shavings. She'd smelled it once before in the gray zone when a rogue had tried to poison a rival's water supply. Wolf's bane. Concentrated enough to kill an alpha in seconds. No, Pamela screamed. She slapped the glass from his hand with enough force that it flew across the space and shattered against the marble floor. The liquid hissed and bubbled where it landed, eating through the polished stone like acid, leaving smoking holes in the marble. The ballroom went deadly silent. Alaric stared at the dissolving floor, then at Pamela, then at the servant who had suddenly gone pale as death. The servant dropped the tray with a clatter and pulled a ceramic blade from his sleeve, a weapon designed to pass undetected through magical wards. But he didn't lunge for the king. He lunged for Pamela. Alaric roared, but he was off balance, still processing the near poisoning. The blade sliced through the air toward Pamela's throat. She threw up her hands uselessly, knowing she was too slow, too weak, too human. Then a small white blur launched itself from beneath the refreshment table. Isla shifted into her wolf form, slammed into the assassin's leg with a snarl that sounded like tearing metal. Her puppy teeth sank into his calf. The man shouted, kicking violently. Isla flew backward, hitting the floor with a yelp that made Pamela's heart stop. That single mistake cost the assassin his life. Alaric was on him before the man could take another breath. There was no interrogation. No questions. Just a blur of lethal motion and the sickening sound of a neck snapping like dry wood. The assassin crumpled to the marble floor, his ceramic blade clattering from lifeless fingers. The king stood over the body, chest heaving, his hands still curved into claws. His eyes had gone completely gold, his wolf barely contained beneath his skin. He looked at Isla first. The pup was shaking but unharmed, scrambling toward Pamela on trembling legs. Then he looked at Pamela, and the raw emotion in his face took her breath away. Shock. Gratitude. Something deeper that she didn't have a name for. Clear the room. Commander Thorne's voice cut through the chaos. Code Black. Full lockdown. Now. Guards in black armor materialized from the shadows, forming an impenetrable ring around the king, Isla, and Pamela. The nobles scattered like startled birds, their gowns and suits a blur of panicked color as they fled toward the exits. Alaric grabbed Pamela and pulled her against his chest, one arm wrapped around her, the other reaching for Isla. His heart hammered against her ear like war drums. You smelled it, he murmured into her hair, his voice shaking with adrenaline and disbelief. You saved my life. Isla, Pamela gasped, trying to pull away to check on the child. She's hurt, she's fine. Thorne has her. His grip tightened. He forced her to look up at him, his hands cupping her face with a gentleness that contradicted the violence still singing in his blood. Why? You could have let me drink it. You would have been free of all this. I told you, Pamela whispered, her hands clutching the front of his shirt. I'm not the one you need to be afraid of. Alaric stared at her like he was seeing her for the first time. Not a servant. Not a temporary inconvenience. Something else entirely. But Commander Thorne's urgent voice shattered the moment. Your Majesty, you need to see this. The commander knelt beside the dead assassin's body. He tore open the man's servant's uniform, revealing the bare chest beneath. Tattooed over the assassin's heart was a sigil, a silver crescent moon pierced by a thorned rose. Alaric's face went ashen. All the blood drained from his features. That's not a rogue's mark, he said, his voice hollow. That's not even a mercenary sign. No, Your Majesty, Thorne said grimly. It's the personal sigil of House Blackthorn. Your family's mark. Pamela felt Alaric's entire body go rigid against hers. She looked up at his face and saw something she'd never seen before in the Wolf King's eyes. Fear. Morgana, he breathed. Commander Thorne reached into the assassin's pocket and pulled out a small silver pendant, a woman's jewelry, expensive and distinctive. He held it up to the candlelight. It was identical to the necklace Lady Morgana had been wearing earlier that evening. The kidnapping, Alaric said slowly, the pieces falling into place with terrible clarity. The 8 months Isla was missing. The magical binding that kept her in wolf form. He looked at Pamela, at Isla trembling in Thorne's arms, at the dissolving marble where the poison had eaten through stone. My sister didn't just fail to find Isla. She's the one who took her. The ballroom was empty now except for guards and the dead assassin. The music had stopped. The candles flickered in a cold wind from the open doors. She orchestrated all of it, Alaric continued, his voice gaining strength and fury. She wanted Isla dead so she could claim the throne. And now, he looked at Pamela with dawning horror. Now she knows you matter to me. Which means you're next on her list. Pamela's blood turned to ice as the full weight of the danger crashed over her. She'd defied a king and survived. She'd faced down her abusive ex-mate and been protected. But she'd just become a target of a woman who had kidnapped a princess and was willing to poison her own brother to seize a crown. And in a castle full of shadows and hidden enemies, there was nowhere left to hide. The lockdown turned Shadow Peak Castle into a fortress within minutes. Steel shutters slammed down over the floor-to-ceiling windows, blocking out the blood moon that hung over the mountains. The only light came from emergency torches mounted in iron sconces along the stone walls, casting everything in flickering orange and shadow. Alaric moved Pamela and Isla to the war room, a reinforced chamber 3 levels below the main castle, built into the mountain itself. It was cold and utilitarian, filled with tactical maps, weapon racks, and communication crystals that pulsed with pale blue light. Guards in full combat armor stood at every entrance, their hands on sword hilts, their eyes scanning for threats. "My sister Morgana," Alaric said, staring at a map where red markers indicated guard positions. His voice was controlled, but Pamela could hear the fury beneath it. "She's been planning this for years. She believed I was weak for signing peace treaties instead of conquering territory. She thought the Blackthorn line had grown soft." He turned to face Pamela and Isla, who huddled together on a bench against the wall. "When I refused to name her as heir after my mate died, she decided to take the throne by force. If Isla dies, the succession breaks. If I die without an heir, the council votes. And Morgana controls most of the council." "We're safe down here though, right?" Pamela asked, pulling Isla closer. The child was in her nightgown now, having shifted back from her wolf form, shivering despite the blankets wrapped around her. Commander Thorn, loading crossbows with silver-tipped bolts, shook his head grimly. "The war room is secure from external assault. But the assassin got inside the castle. That means Morgana has compromised our security. We're not hiding, Miss Warren. We're waiting for a siege." As if summoned by his words, the torches flickered and died. The communication crystals went dark. The mechanical hum of the air circulation system ground to a halt. Complete, suffocating darkness. "They've cut the power," Alaric's voice came from the blackness, deadly calm. "Thorn, defensive positions. Anything that comes through those doors, you kill it." "Yes, Your Majesty." Pamela heard movement in the dark, the sound of steel being drawn, boots repositioning on stone. Then a small flame sparked to life as Alaric lit a single candle. His face looked carved from granite in the dancing light, all sharp angles and cold determination. He moved to the weapon rack and selected a silver dagger, its blade etched with protective runes. He crossed to Pamela and pressed the cold metal into her palm. "Do you remember what I taught you in the gardens last week?" he asked quietly. She'd thought it was paranoia when he'd insisted on basic combat training. Now she understood. Point and thrust. Aim for soft targets. Don't hesitate. Good. His hands covered hers, warm and steady. "If anyone comes through that door and it isn't me or Thorn, you use this. You don't ask questions. You don't show mercy. You protect Isla. What about you?" Pamela's voice cracked. "I'm going hunting." His eyes flashed gold as his wolf rose to the surface. "I'm going to clear this castle room by room and drag my sister out of whatever hole she's hiding in." He leaned down, and for a heartbeat, his forehead rested against hers. The contact sent electricity racing through her body, making her breath catch. "Stay alive, Pamela," he growled, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite hide. "That's an order from your king." Then he was gone, vanishing into the shadows with half the guards, leaving only Thorn and 2 others to protect the war room. 20 agonizing minutes passed. Pamela sat on the cold floor with Isla in her lap, the silver dagger heavy in her hand. The child was trying to be brave, but her small body trembled. "Pammy," Isla whispered. "I hear bad people. Lots of them. Coming down the stairs." Pamela's enhanced hearing caught it a moment later, the sound of armored boots, too many to count, descending toward them with military precision. Then she smelled it. Sweet. Sickly. Wrong. Not smoke. Gas. Silver-laced poison was being pumped through the ventilation shafts, invisible and deadly. It wouldn't kill them immediately, but it would weaken them, make them slow and sick, easy prey for whoever was coming. Commander, Pamela choked out, her eyes already watering. They're gassing us out. Thorn cursed viciously. He looked at the sealed steel door, their only exit, then at the ventilation grate where pale vapor was beginning to seep through. We can't stay here, he said. We'll suffocate. But opening the door meant walking into whatever force was waiting outside. Pamela made a decision. The servant passages. There's a laundry chute in the corridor that leads to the lower levels. I used it when I was learning the castle. Thorn looked at her sharply. Can you reach it? If we move now. He nodded once. I'll clear the path. You run. Don't stop. Don't look back. He punched the manual override, and the steel door hissed open. The corridor beyond was filled with smoke and the clash of steel. Thorn charged out with a battle cry, his sword flashing in the torchlight. Pamela grabbed Isla and ran. They sprinted down the stone hallway, Pamela's lungs burning from the gas, Isla's small hand gripping her nightgown. Behind them, she heard Thorn fighting the ring of metal, shouts, the thud of bodies hitting stone. They reached the laundry chute just as soldiers in black armor rounded the corner. Not castle guards. Mercenaries wearing Morgana's silver crescent sigil. There, one shouted. The Omega and the Princess. Pamela shoved Isla into the metal chute. The child slid down into darkness, her scream fading as she dropped. Bullets sparked off the stone wall beside Pamela's head. She threw herself into the chute just as hands grabbed for her ankles. She tumbled through blackness, hitting the pile of linens at the bottom with bone-jarring force. Isla was already scrambling up, tears streaming down her face. Run! Pamela gasped, pulling the child toward the maze of servant tunnels that snaked through the castle's foundation. Behind them, boots thundered down the chute. They were being hunted. And Alaric was somewhere in the castle, unaware that his daughter and the woman who'd saved his life were running for their lives through the darkness with nowhere left to hide. They ran through the servant tunnels, narrow passages carved through the mountain stone, lit only by dim emergency lights that flickered like dying stars. Pamela's lungs burned, her legs screamed, but she didn't stop. Isla stumbled beside her, barefoot and terrified, her nightgown torn and dirty. Behind them, the boots kept coming. Closer. Always closer. Pamela took a sharp turn and found themselves in the castle armory, a vast chamber filled with weapon racks, hanging shields, and mannequins dressed in ancient armor. A dead end. The only other exit was blocked by a heavy iron gate, locked from the outside. No, 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 Pamela gasped, pulling desperately at the bars. They didn't budge. The footsteps stopped. A slow, deliberate clapping echoed through the armory. Well done, Miss Warren, a smooth voice called out. You made it farther than I expected. Lady Morgana stepped into the torchlight and she was transformed. Gone was the elegant courtier in silk gowns. She wore black battle armor etched with silver runes, fitted perfectly to her tall frame. Her raven hair was pulled back in a warrior's braid. In her hand, she carried an ancient longsword with a blade that seemed to drink the light. She looked like a dark goddess of war. A barren nobody, Morgana said, circling them slowly like a predator, thinking she can play queen. Did you really believe my brother would choose you? A broken Omega from the gray zone. She laughed, the sound like breaking glass. You were useful, I'll give you that. A convenient distraction while I positioned my pieces. You took Isla, Pamela breathed, pushing the child behind her. You kidnapped your own niece. Took? I saved the kingdom from weakness. Morgana's eyes flashed silver. My brother is soft. He signs treaties when he should conquer. He shows mercy to enemies who deserve death. The Blackthorn line was dying under his rule. She pointed the sword at Isla, who whimpered and pressed against Pamela's legs. That child was supposed to die 8 months ago. Clean. Quick. Blamed on rogues. But the witch I hired botched the spell, and instead of killing her, it just trapped her in wolf form. Why? Pamela asked, desperately looking for anything she could use as a weapon. A discarded chain hung from a nearby rack. Torch oil and clay pots lined the wall. Why? Morgana's smile was cold as winter. Because with Isla dead and Alaric grief-stricken, the council would have removed him. Too unstable to rule, they'd say. And I would have taken the throne. I would have made this kingdom strong again. She advanced slowly. But then you found her. You fed her. You kept her alive. Her voice dripped with venom. You ruined everything. You're insane, Pamela whispered. I'm ambitious. There's a difference. Morgana raised the ancient blade. Torchlight ran along its edge like liquid fire. But I can still salvage this. I'll kill the child. Kill you. Frame my brother for the murders, say he went mad with paranoia, turned on his own household. The council will execute him, and I'll take the throne as the grieving sister who restored order. She stepped forward, the sword aimed at Isla's small, trembling form. Don't you dare touch her, Pamela screamed. She grabbed the hanging chain and swung it with everything she had. It caught Morgana across the face, sending her staggering backward. Pamela didn't wait. She snatched a clay pot of torch oil from the wall and hurled it. It shattered against Morgana's armor, coating her in flammable liquid. Run, Isla. Hide. Pamela grabbed a torch from the wall and threw it at Morgana's feet. Flames erupted, forcing the woman to leap back. Pamela lunged for the weapon rack, her fingers closing around a silver dagger, the same type Alaric had given her. She spun just as Morgana came through the flames, her armor smoking, her face twisted in rage. The ancient sword met the silver dagger with a shriek of metal. Pamela wasn't a warrior. She had no training beyond a week of basic drills. But she was desperate, and desperation made her fierce. She fought like a cornered animal, all instinct and survival. She slashed wildly, forcing Morgana back. She grabbed another chain and wrapped it around the woman's sword arm. She kicked over weapon racks, creating obstacles. But Morgana was an alpha, a trained killer, a woman who had spent centuries perfecting the art of violence. She caught Pamela's wrist, twisted brutally, and sent the dagger clattering across the stone floor. Then she grabbed Pamela by the throat and slammed her against the wall with enough force to crack stone. You fought well, Morgana hissed, her fingers tightening like iron bands around Pamela's neck. For a reject. But this is where your story ends. Pamela clawed at the hands choking her, her vision going black at the edges. Her lungs screamed for air that wouldn't come. Her legs kicked uselessly. This was it. This was how she died. Not in the gray zone where she'd expected to freeze or starve. But in a castle, wearing a torn velvet gown, choking on marble floors she'd never belonged on. But through her fading vision, she saw Isla. The child was safe, hidden behind a fallen shield, her mismatched eyes wide with terror but alive. Still alive. Pamela stopped struggling. She met Morgana's cold eyes and managed one last thought as the darkness closed in. Isla would live. The king would find her. And that was enough. That was enough. The armory doors didn't open. They exploded. The iron hinges tore from stone with a sound like thunder. The massive double doors flew inward, crashing against the walls hard enough to embed in the rock. Through the opening came something that wasn't quite wolf and wasn't quite nightmare. It was a beast the size of a warhorse, with fur as black as a moonless night and eyes that burned like molten gold. A spectral crown of silver fire hovered above its massive head, marking it as royalty even in this primal form. Blood matted its fur. Its fangs were longer than daggers, dripping with the gore of whatever had stood between it and this room. King Alaric Blackthorn had arrived, and he was no longer a man trying to control his wolf. He was pure apex predator unleashed. Morgana's hands released Pamela's throat in shock. Pamela collapsed to the floor, gasping and choking, her vision swimming with black spots. "Brother," Morgana said, trying to recover her composure, raising her sword. "How lovely of you two." The wolf moved faster than physics should allow. One moment it was at the doorway, The next it had crossed 30 feet and slammed into Morgana with the force of an avalanche. The ancient sword went flying. Morgana's armored body hit the stone wall so hard the rock cracked in a spiderweb pattern. She tried to shift, to call her own wolf, but Alaric was already on her. His massive jaws clamped around her armored shoulder, and he shook her like a rag doll. Metal screamed. Bone cracked. Morgana's scream of pain echoed through the armory. He threw her across the room. She crashed through a weapon rack, swords and shields clattering around her broken form. She tried to crawl away, her left arm hanging useless, her face a mask of blood and terror. The black wolf stalked toward her, each step deliberate, unhurried. This wasn't a fight. This was an execution. Alaric, Morgana choked, blood bubbling from her lips. I'm your sister. Your blood. The wolf's growl shook dust from the ceiling. He opened his jaws, preparing for the killing strike that would end her treachery forever. Daddy, stop. The small voice cut through the bloodlust like a silver bell ringing in darkness. Isla crawled out from behind the fallen shield, tears streaming down her face, her small hands outstretched. Daddy, please. No more blood. No more. The massive wolf froze, its fangs inches from Morgana's exposed throat. It stood trembling, caught between the instinct to kill and the voice of the child it had fought so hard to save. Slowly, painfully, the beast began to shift. Bones cracked and reformed. Black fur receded into scarred skin. The spectral crown faded. In moments, a man knelt where the wolf had been, naked, covered in wounds and other people's blood, his chest heaving with ragged breaths. Alaric looked human again, but his eyes still burned with that terrible golden fire. He stood on shaking legs and kicked Morgana's broken body aside like refuse. Commander Thorn, he roared, his voice raw and damaged. Get in here. Secure the traitor. Guards flooded into the armory, surrounding Morgana's bleeding form with drawn weapons. But Alaric had already forgotten his sister. He dropped to his knees beside Pamela, gathering her into his arms with a gentleness that contradicted the violence still singing through his blood. Pamela, he choked out, one hand cradling her bruised neck, the other brushing her tangled brown hair from her face. Pamela, breathe. Look at me. Don't you dare leave. She tried to speak, but her throat was too damaged. Only a harsh rasp came out. Shoo, don't talk. His hands were shaking as he checked her pulse, felt the flutter of her heartbeat against his palm. You're alive. You're alive. Thank the gods, you're alive. He pulled her against his chest, buried his face in her hair, and inhaled deeply. His entire body went rigid. The scent hit him like a physical blow. Beneath the smoke and blood and fear, there was something else. Something sweet and wild and perfect, like pine forests after rain, like home, like everything he'd been searching for without knowing it. The mate bond. It had been there all along, growing stronger with every defiant word she'd spoken, every moment she'd chosen Isla over safety, every time she'd proven herself braver than trained warriors. But he'd been too blind, too stubborn, too convinced that an alpha king couldn't be fated to a broken omega from the gray zone. Except she wasn't broken. She had never been broken. She was his. The mate bond, he whispered against her skin, his voice cracking with wonder and grief and overwhelming relief. You're my mate. My true mate. How did I not see it? Pamela's fingers weakly clutched his shoulder, trying to tell him something, to ask about Isla, to... She's safe, Alaric said, reading her concern. He looked over at where Commander Thorn had wrapped Isla in his cloak, checking her for injuries. Our daughter is safe because of you. Our daughter. The words hung in the air between them, a promise and a claim and a future all at once. I've got you, Alaric whispered, pressing his forehead to hers, letting his warmth flow into her cold, battered body. I've got both of you now. I'm not letting either of you go. Not ever. Isla broke free from Thorn and ran to them, throwing herself into their embrace. Alaric wrapped one arm around his daughter, the other holding Pamela, creating a circle of protection around the two people who had somehow, impossibly, become his entire world. "I've got you, my queen," he murmured into Pamela's hair as consciousness finally began to slip from her grasp. "I've got you both." And for the first time in 5 years, Pamela let herself fall into the darkness without fear. Because she knew when she woke up, he would still be there. They both would. Pamela woke to sunlight. Real sunlight, not the gray-filtered light of the fog-shrouded zone, but golden rays streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked mountain peaks dusted with snow. She was lying in a bed so soft it felt like floating on clouds, wrapped in black silk sheets that smelled like cedar and leather and something distinctly masculine. She tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Her throat burned. Her body ached everywhere. Bruises painted her arms in shades of purple and yellow. "Easy," a deep voice rumbled. Alaric sat in a chair beside the bed, still shirtless, bandages wrapped around his ribs and shoulder from the battle. His dark hair was disheveled, his face shadowed with exhaustion, but his golden eyes were alert and focused entirely on her. He poured water from a crystal pitcher and held the glass to her lips with gentle hands. Small sips. "Your throat was badly damaged." The water was cool and sweet, soothing the raw burning. When she'd drunk enough, he set the glass aside and took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "How long?" she rasped. 2 days. "The physicians kept you sedated while your body healed." His grip tightened slightly. "Morgana is in the dungeon, bound in silver chains. Her co-conspirators have been executed. The traitors in the guard have been purged. It's over." Pamela's eyes drifted to the windows, to the sunlight and freedom beyond. Isla, downstairs eating her weight in honey cakes and terrorizing the kitchen staff. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "She's been sneaking up here every hour to check if you're awake yet. She's been sleeping in a nest of blankets on your floor." Relief flooded through Pamela so intensely she felt tears prick her eyes. Alaric's expression grew serious. He reached for a leather folder on the bedside table and opened it, revealing medical documents covered in dense script. "While you were unconscious, I had the royal physician run a complete analysis." His voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear the fury simmering beneath. "There were traces of silver-laced contraceptive herbs in your blood. High concentrations. Years' worth of accumulated poison." Pamela went very still. "Marcus," Alaric continued, his jaw tightening. "Your former mate was dosing you systematically from the moment you pair-bonded with him. Silver suppresses a wolf's fertility, weakens their ability to shift, makes them submissive and tired. He kept you weak deliberately." "I was never barren," Pamela whispered, the words feeling strange and impossible on her tongue. "You were sabotaged." Alaric leaned forward, his eyes burning with intensity. "Your father was a powerful gamma in the Silver Pine Pack. Marcus feared you might inherit that strength, might challenge his authority. So he poisoned you, used you, and when he tired of the charade, he threw you away with a lie." The room seemed to spin. 5 years of shame. 5 years of believing she was defective, broken, worthless. And it had all been a deliberate cruelty. "The physician flushed the toxins from your system," Alaric said softly. "It will take time for your wolf to fully recover, but she's there, Pamela. She's strong. And she's compatible." "Compatible with what?" "With me." He stood, moving to kneel beside the bed so they were eye level. The Wolf King, crowned ruler of the greatest pack in the realm, on his knees before a woman the world had rejected. "I smelled the mate bond the moment you defied me on your cabin porch," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I denied it because I thought it was impossible. Kings don't mate with outcasts. But you're not an outcast. You're a survivor. A warrior. You saved my daughter. You saved my life. You saved my kingdom." He took both her hands in his, and she felt the tremor in his fingers. "I could command you to stay. I could use my authority as your king. But I won't." He met her eyes, and she saw vulnerability there that she'd never expected from someone so powerful. "I'm asking, Pamela. Not commanding. Be my Luna. Be Isla's mother. Be my queen." The proposal hung in the air between them, terrifying and beautiful and completely overwhelming. Pamela looked at this man who had burned down her cabin and then given her a castle, who had threatened to kill her and then nearly died protecting her, who wore a crown of iron and wolf bone but was kneeling before her like she was the one with all the power. "I have a condition," she said quietly. Alaric blinked, clearly surprised. "Name it." "I want to help other rejected Omegas. The ones living in the gray zones, the ones cast out by cruel alphas, the ones who believe the lies they've been told about being worthless." Her voice grew stronger despite the pain in her throat. "I want to create sanctuaries, safe houses, programs to detect poisoning and abuse. No one else should have to suffer what I did." Alaric stared at her for a long moment. Then he smiled, a real smile that transformed his entire face, making him look younger, lighter, almost boyish. "Done," he said simply. "You can have an entire wing of the castle. A budget. Whatever you need." He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "My queen can reshape this kingdom however she sees fit." "Then yes," Pamela whispered. "I'll be your Luna. I'll be Isla's mother. I'll be your queen." The coronation was held 3 weeks later under the full moon. Pamela stood in the throne room wearing a gown of midnight blue velvet embroidered with silver wolves, her brown hair crowned with a circlet of white gold and moonstone. She didn't look like the gaunt woman from the gray zone anymore, but she hadn't been transformed into someone unrecognizable either. She was still herself, just stronger, healthier, loved. Alaric placed the crown on her head with hands that were surprisingly gentle. "Queen Pamela Warren Blackthorn," he announced to the assembled court. "Luna of Shadow Peak. Mother of the air. My mate. My equal. My heart." The wolves howled their approval, the sound echoing through the mountains until it seemed the whole realm was singing. Isla stood beside the throne in a white dress, clapping and beaming with pure joy. "Pammy's a queen. I told you she was special." That night, as Pamela stood on the balcony overlooking her new kingdom, Alaric came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "Any regrets?" he murmured against her neck. She thought about the cabin in the gray zone. The hunger. The loneliness. The years of believing she was worthless. Then she looked at Isla sleeping peacefully in the next room, at the castle full of people she was learning to lead, at the man who had somehow become her home. "None," she said. "Not a single one." The girl they had called Baron now wore a crown. The Omega they had thrown away now ruled a kingdom. And she would make absolutely certain that no wolf, no matter how broken the world claimed they were, would ever be cast aside again. Because sometimes the things the world rejects turn out to be the most valuable treasures of all. And Pamela Warren Blackthorn, Queen of Shadow Peak, was living proof. What do you think? If you were Pamela, would you have torn up that contract and stayed? Or would you have taken the gold and run? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of betrayal, survival, and second chances, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. Thanks for listening, and remember, you're never as broken as they try to make you believe.